We are very fortunate to have Paul Wolf and Jed Williamson with us. Paul Wolf is the Outdoor Leadership Program Coordinator at Southwestern Community College. He's a former Outward Bound instructor at the Voyager Outward Bound School and currently works or serves as a member of the Accreditation Council for AEE. Paul's actually going to be at our 2018 International Conference in November doing a workshop on how to be an AEE accreditation reviewer. So we appreciate your service there, Paul. And Jed Williamson, you may have heard of him. Jed was the president of Sterling College, is currently the president emeritus of Sterling College. He was actually one of the original authors of the first edition of the AEE Standards Manual and helped found the accreditation program back in the 90s. He's also a former Outward Bound instructor, and you may also know him from his work previously as the editor of Accidents in North American Mountaineering. We are very excited to have these two storytellers with us today. Both of them have a deep, deep well of experience, both in the practice of outdoor education and in teaching that topic to others. So we're really excited to have you both here today. We're going to start off with a story from Paul Wolf. Involves an extended wilderness trip in the Boundary Waters. And the moment he hears out in the distance a call for help. I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Paul, and we can get things started.
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for setting this up, Dan, and I want to mention I'm deeply honored to be presenting today with Jed. So I'm the warm-up act, then we'll build up to the main show. My story starts, or it goes back 31 years. Actually, it goes to Friday, August 21st is going to be when the decisions were made. At this point, I'm 24 years old. I've just finished my first year in graduate school at a college used to be known as Mankato State University in an experiential education program. We had just gotten a new professor that year, the 33-year-old Jasper Hunt. So this summer, I'm hired at the Voyager Outward Bound School as an intern, and I get my first assistant instructorship. And this is on an Outward Bound directive course, which I think now is known as the Intercept program. These are for youth at risk. So I am assigned to OBD 22 in the Harmon Brigade with Billy as the instructor and myself as the assistant. And we have 8 14 and 15-year-old young males with a variety of issues that they're dealing with, from recent suicide attempts to death of parents to violent outbursts to substance abuse. Very diverse background from around the country, but they had one thing in common. None of them wanted to be there. So we also had a sister brigade, the Henry Brigade, that had Kathy as this instructor, and then a fellow named Scott as assistant, who was brand new, who had 8 students, both male and female. So this takes place in the Boundary Waters canoe area. And so I'm going to try to put this up on the screen. For those of you who haven't had the luxury to go, the Boundary Waters canoe area is 1 million acres of roadless wilderness, designated back in 1978 as its own wilderness act. It's connected up here. All the green that you see on the screen here is the BWCA. Above that is the Quetico Provincial Park and then Northern Lights. And we are talking fairly remote here. The base camp, called Home Place, my cursor's showing, is down here at the bottom of the screen on the Quishwe River. And where this will be taking place is way up in the upper part of the map, somewhere right up here in Fish Lake. So that puts it about right here, with Home Place being there. I'll get into communication here in a bit, but the Boundary Waters is unique in the form that it is very difficult to travel on foot. It's mainly swamps, rocky ridges. It's not a place you get out of a canoe and just walk out of. So the other thing that's probably useful to point out is that in 1987, communication was much different. We didn't carry cell phones. Matter of fact, cell phones in those days cost $1,500 at Radio Shack and were the size of small toasters. They were called car phones. We had, for our communication, if we had an issue, we had to list evacuation points along the way. So what that looks like is, here's a little bit of nostalgia for anybody who's worked at Outward Bound in the old days. This is our course plan, showing where we're at, where our camp location, and the end of this over here is ultimately where communication points are at. So at the crux of the story, we're on Solo, and for us to communicate would involve a 20-mile paddle and multiple portages back to Prairie Portage, which would be a Canadian ranger station where we would then be able to hopefully find a ranger there and would have to radio in. So that's probably a little different. And I do have a brief shot of, here's a young 24-year-old Paul lifting his head net, just briefly enough for this picture. That's a snowman pancake, by the way. We're remote, and that's important to know. So our course starts out with a 5-day immersion, and we end up back at base camp for a 4-day phase of doing challenge courses and other related activities. And then we head out after a resupply for an 18-day main expedition. And that was kind of a side story there. During the course of our immersion, the instructor tent poles had shock cording had given loose. These were Eureka 2-person timberline tents. Students had 4-person versions of it. So I traded it over to Scott Bigelow at the time, and he handed me a new set, and then we packed up the van and we drove 2.5 hours up to our put-in point, and we had paddled 6 miles in multiple portages. And we were dealing with the behavioral issues, so I went over to set up the tent while Billy, the instructor, took care of it. And as I rolled out the tent, it was awfully quiet. There should have been a clink, clink, clink that happened, and I had come to the realization that I had forgot the tent poles back at base camp. So this means now 28 days. And if you've ever been in the Boundary Waters in August, you know it's prime mosquito season. They're about the size of small ducks, known to carry children away. So I had to go approach the instructor on my first Outward Bound course and tell him, oh, by the way, I forgot the tent poles, which the students found very interesting as well, because they had proposed one solution of us bunking in with them on their 4-person tents. And then all of them decided to turn to us and say, consequences. So those same natural consequences that we did with the students also work for us, but we made do. We figured it out. These days, my students can just get on the sat phone and call in and say we forgot the cheese and expect me to come out and bring it to them. Back then in the days, our only real communication was a whistle that we wore around our neck, which comes in a little bit. So we had headed out an expedition, and after a number of days of travel through Whitewater and climbing, we end up then moving to Solo. And our Solo is a 2-day, 2-night. And this occurs in the Boundary Waters. It's Forest Service regulation. You have to stay at designated campsites on the main route. So some people don't know, within the Boundary Waters, there are things called primitive management areas. And each PMA zone has different zones in them. And they're essentially a wilderness inside of a wilderness. A recent stat I looked at, over 250,000 people a year visit the Boundary Waters, and only 400 of that 250,000 ever go into a PMA. There's no portages anymore. There's no campsites. And you pretty much have to bushwhack your way in. For us, it was called crashing, because that's a sound that your 100-pound aluminum grumming canoe makes as you take a compass bearing and punch through the woods to get back to these remote lakes. So my story happens here on Fish Lake in the Pitfall Lake PMA in Zone 3. Our sister brigade, meanwhile, who's traveling a day apart from us, had entered Zone 1 and had made their way down to Bullfrog Lake. And this is where students are placed out on rocky points. Back then, we no longer had mandatory fasting at Outward Bound. Our students had the luxury to select 2 cups of granola for their 2-day experience. So our students are on a solo, and we do daily and morning and evening checks on them. But we now come to the last morning of solo, where we had planned to pull them off, and this is where kind of the meat of the story begins. So We get out of the tent at first light and we're getting ready to pack up. We're going to bring the students in late morning and then get together, feed them, and then they would head up for their 4-day final expedition to get back to home place. And as we're in our instructor campsite, we hear a long, lonely, distant call for help. Billy and I looked at each other and thought, well, if our students have an issue, they're going to do what they've been trained. They're going to blow in their whistle. There's going to be a whistle train, and we will react just like 911. By the way, 911 was only actually formally put in place the year before in '86 in northern Minnesota, to give you a little perspective on communication. So we hear this call for help and we realize that it's probably one of our boys getting a little antsy. So we get in the canoe and paddle across the lake to where this is coming. And we ask the student, what's going on? He says, can you hear that? He said, it's someone calling for help out there. And out there is nowhere. I'm going to try to bring up a map here. So here's us at this, what used to be a campsite on this point on Fish Lake. And we paddled across to the lake to this shoreline where the student was reporting it was coming from somewhere out here. We found that a little unusual, but we decided to go ahead and gather up all of our boys who had been around the lake at this point. We bring them into the site and we feed them. We still hear the call for help. We're deciding what to do, and then entering through Gift Lake onto Fish Lake and paddling by us at breakneck speed doing a hut stroke, which is a racing stroke. We see a solo canoe and they're not paying any attention. They're just racing and we don't know what's going on. We're even now more confused. Well, a short while later, the solo canoe comes around the point and it turns out to be a volunteer Forest Service backcountry ranger. And this ranger is saying, do you hear the call for help? And we say, yes, we do. We don't know what it is or what it could be. Well, here's where it comes into play. Billy, the instructor, myself, and the ranger at this point decide a plan of action. And our plan turns out to be this. We decide, yes?
Can I stop you right there?
Yes, absolutely.
Before you tell the exciting conclusion of this plan, can I have a poll set up, and I'm going to see if what our attendees might do in this situation. So I'm launching a poll. You all should see that, and it basically just says, what would you do next? Stay with your group and send the ranger, leave your group and go search for the lost persons, get your students involved in the search, or continue on with your course and hope for the best. So we'll take just a quick second to see what folks might do at this point, and then we'll find out what you did, Paul. Already seeing most of our attendees say they would get their students involved with the search. I'm going to go ahead, close this poll. 100%. Everybody wants to get their students involved in the search. All right. Well, that's what you all would do. Let's hear how the story continues.
Well, this is the decision we make. We also have, by the way, for anyone who's worked at Outward Bound, an instructor handbook full of local operating procedures, which I'm sure somewhere in the middle of that, there isn't a real specific, this is, if you hear call for help on solo, do this. But I'm sure in here it says, at no point should you ever leave your group unattended, especially a group of juvenile delinquents prone to violent outbursts. We've had multiple incidents. And we decide, the ranger, the instructor, and myself decide to leave our group. We tell them, they're quite happy, they've been fed, that we don't know what is going on, but the ranger also has a more detailed map. The maps we carried at that point, Fisher and Mackenzie's, don't have topo lines and anything for the backcountry. He has a more detailed map, and the three of us decide to leave the group. And we go across the lake. And remember the part about the impending thunderstorm? Well, the ranger and Billy and I start making our way up the ridge, and we're calling out, hello, and we're getting back responses for help. And it's still faint in distance, and we make our way up this ridge line, and we get to the top, And at that, we call out hello, and we get an unintelligible other response of somebody talking to us. And then the sky let loose. Lightning starts coming down around us, 1 second, flash boom counts. It's torrential. And the three of us decide to backtrack down the ridge to the shoreline, and we hunker down a lightning position for what now seems like an eternity. Well, eventually, we look into the woods, and approaching us are two what appear to be drowned rats. They're two 14-year-old, a male and female, in Helly Hansen slicker suits that are ghost white and terrified. And we find out they are these two of the students from our sister brigade over here on Bullfrog Lake that had, the one student had visited the female during the evening and tried to get back to a site, couldn't find it, so she tried to help with, and they, somewhere in the line, ended up in the backcountry, going away from Bullfrog Lake towards Midas, coming around from what we could tell, and made their way through this drainage swamp, eventually to Fish Lake. So on a sidelight, that morning when Kathy and Scott were doing their solo checks, they realized, the instructors, that two of their students were missing. They went ahead, pulled the remaining 6 students in, and Kathy, their instructor, decided to paddle across the lake and began going solo pursuit of the 2 students. When she first made visual contact with them, she looked out, and this is hours later, she saw them in the middle of a swamp, flailing in a near drowning situation. Did I mention it's very difficult to walk through the backcountry? And she said her heart sunk. She said, I'm going to watch 2 of my students die. And she said, there goes my career. This is not going to work out well. Well, the good news is that the students made it to us. We paddled them back to our campsite. Kathy eventually appears on the shoreline of Fish Lake, and we come and pick her up. And we decide ultimately then, since we were heading out on final, to load everybody up, and we went through Gift Lake down and brought them back to their spot on Bullfrog Lake. So this is, the next 4 days go on. We arrive at home place, and we pull up to the dock, and the course director asks, so how'd it go? And I proceeded to tell him the story. And that's where my interjection here ends, and I'm going to open this back to you, Dan, for comment and questions and feedback.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Well, there's a lot going on in that story. And just a reminder to the audience that this is your moment. If you have any questions or comments, type them in the chat, but I certainly have some of my own. And you know, my first one is going to be about your decision to leave the group unsupervised and go on a trek to see if you can help out with these lost students. So there's even a lot within that one question, but maybe you can tell me a little more about that decision, and if you look at it differently today than you did back then.
Well, you know, I've got a flashback to my 24-year-old invincible self, and my first Outward Bound course. I also felt an impending duty and call to action to people in distress. My assessment at the time of this was that we had 8, 14, and 15-year-old boys that have spent the last 2 days on minimal calories, and they have not always been, they've been a handful, and they are quite now content. We also have this very impending thunderstorm. And for people die every year in the Boundary Waters. Bob's instructor died 9 years later from this point on a OBD course, struck by lightning on Lake One. We've had brigades struck before, ground current. Our boys were in a pretty safe and secure spot. They were pretty happy. They were well fed. They were okay. We turned to them and said, we just need you to chill, and we need to go out. So the idea of just one of us heading out, well, what if we got struck by lightning? We were very exposed. Should it be myself and a ranger that's a volunteer that we don't know? I mean, in the end, everybody turned out okay. Did we violate a, a local operating procedure and would I expect people to leave their group? No. Um, so
Jed, any thoughts on that?
Well, I would be concerned that I'd had 8 other victims, potential victims on my hand if I took them out to go look for the blowing whistle. So they're in a known place. They're probably not going to run anywhere, and they're safe. And they could become another liability if I took them with me.
And along those same lines, Paul, the part of the story that I'm kind of really curious to hear is you get back to your group, and they've been by themselves for a little while. Were they total what was it, Lord of the Flies kind of situation, or did they do what they were supposed to do?
they were chill. They were sitting on a full food pack after 2 days of 2 cups of granola. They were hunkered down. They didn't really want to go out on a thunderstorm in the middle of a lake. They were just like happy to see other human beings, and they were at the best behavior. For those who've ever done an Outward Bound course, 3 days, you know, you work with an Outward Bound directive course, you work hard. I mean, we had earlier in this course, one of them tried to push one of them off the top of a climbing site. We had a runner. We had multiple physical altercations. And they were, you know, then you put them alone on a rock for 2 or 3 days and they gain a lot of introspective, and they were good. You know, they helped out, you know, we returned the other students. So in the end, you know, obviously I feel okay. It certainly could have taken multiple other turns.
The other thing that comes up for me while we talk about this is sort of, and I've dealt with this as an instructor myself. There are times where you maybe shouldn't trust your students so much, and then there are times where you should, or maybe where you really need to. And my experience has been when things get real, is the time that I can trust my students a lot more than when it's just a normal day on the river and everything's going fine. Have you also had that experience, or have you seen or have thoughts about when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate to trust your students?
I mean, I've certainly employed my students in calls to action and evacs and that through the, you know, the last 30 years. But I've selected them in every group. Not every one of them is equal. And I mean, in reflection, I could have talked to them more about a democratic process and maybe them picking a leader or doing something else. But the storm was coming and someone was out there, and going back to the communication, there was no one else to help. And so we felt that rise to duty. And yes, do I have a duty to my 8 students? But true. But I think they were okay. And I had that feeling. And that's why the 3 of us felt that we could work best together,
Yeah.
in pursuit of them. So, you know, there's a statement about good judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgment. So, I, you know, I would like to say, I do not, I mean, Jasper Hunt called textbooks and instructor handbooks like this a compendium of stored experiences. There is decades of knowledge, and there are things that I practice today. My students, I require 24/7 to have whistles. I'm serious about bare feet. I believe that same thing of teaching CPR within the, you know, before leaving the first campsite. Every one of those has, you know, taking rest breaks every 2 hours of driving. Every one of those has a backstory of stored experience, and many of them involve deaths and other very serious things. So I do not take lightly that, oh, you know, these policies are just in case you want to do them. But there is a time and place for people to deviate from a standard and from a policy, because like Paul Petzold said, rules are for fools. You can't possibly script every situation. And ultimately in those, you know, you have to put some thought into it of why. And then at the end, you need to be humble and be able to say, this is what I did, and lay it down bare and be able to learn. I see Steve's comment in there, who was working at Voyager with us at the time too. This was
on the chat, I believe.
this was debriefed quite a bit, and we looked at those. So that's what I lay out there of, that was my 24-year-old invincible outward bound self. And since that point, I've gained a lot more experience, and hopefully my judgment has increased as well.
Sure. So one last question before we move on to Jed's story. Nowadays, you spend a lot more time in the classroom. I'm pretty sure you still get out in the field a fair amount. But when you're trying to teach some of these concepts, like how to develop judgment, how to know when you might want to deviate from your policy manual because your judgment might lead you to think that there's a better course of action. How do you teach that to the upcoming generation of outdoor educators?
I try to tell them stories and some of the background. I mean, I'll tell you this in ending. My students don't understand why I need to wear a whistle 24/7 around my neck. Some say, oh, I've got it on my Fast-Tex buckle on my pack. What's the purpose of that? And I explain why. So this last November, I have a wilderness therapy field experience group out, and we are in bear hunting season, and we're wearing full blaze orange vests and hats and whistles on. And I said, the other thing, besides minimal energy for maximum contact when you're lost, I said, whistles scare bears. And if you've been in the boundary waters and that, you've dealt with them. So we just had that talk the day before, and then the next day, they're in a very remote campsite, and a group of bear hunters run a bear into the camp and are shooting at this moving bear, which we could talk ethics of that later. But the first students saw the bear, blew the whistle, everyone else blew, the bear turned, and they shot the bear within 20 feet of one of my students. We were not doing anything wrong. We were all fully blazed, etc. I'll tell you this now, those 8 students who were on that trip, and then immediately the sat phone rang. I was told the story. Now we have immediacy in communication. They text me and say, we forgot the cheese, please bring it to me. I dealt with 18 days without tent poles. Those 8 students never have to be told again why a whistle is important.
Well, that's a great example of a story that teaches a powerful lesson, and a couple of stories. So thank you for that. I hope the folks are able to take away some valuable lessons from that. And we'll talk more about some of these concepts. And also, I see you pulling up that sat phone. After Jed's talk, I think we'll probably talk a little more about the evolution of technology and how that's affected our risk management practices and our judgment along the way. But now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jed Williamson, who's got a story. Apparently, there was a time where there were not many policies about guides wearing helmets. But I think after this story, that policy changed. Jed, you're on.
Thank you. And I agree with Paul. Thank you for doing this, Dan. It's a great idea, I think. And it's good to be with Paul again. We served on the council together for quite a few years. So good to be back. This story is, I'm telling is on myself because that's always a good idea. The story takes place in 1999. During summers, no matter what I was doing, even working for Outward Bound, I would always manage to find time to go to the Tetons. I started climbing there in 1959, oops. It is now 1999. I am president of Sterling College, but I still get out there for 2 or 3 weeks in the summertime. That's how I spent my vacations. And so having been involved with the company since about 1963, off and on, I had a lot of experience with them and with climbing the various routes in the Tetons and with all of our routines and local operating procedures. Well, this story is about guiding a group of 3 people. The guide ratio on the Grand is one guide and 3 clients. This particular story takes place with 3 guides besides myself, so a total of 12 clients, 4 guides, 3 clients each. Now, the way that the routine works is that they go to school for 2 days. They go to beginning and intermediate school, and then prepare for the grand. We begin very early well, no, we don't. We begin at 10 o'clock in the morning to go to the lower saddle, which you can see in that previous picture right above the snow. It's smack in the middle of that picture. So we go, we leave at 10 in the morning and we arrive at the lower saddle sometime between hopefully 2 and 5 in the afternoon. It's a long haul from down in the valley behind that ridge if you drop that plus sign down. It begins at 6,000 feet, way down in the Lupin Meadows parking lot. You go all the way up through the canyon there and get to the lower saddle. And then in the evening, we provide a briefing for the clients. And the briefing talks about what we're going to be doing the next day and the route and the preparations that we have to make. One of the preparations is that we don't have the clients bring their helmets with them. The less they have to carry, the better it's going to be to get to the lower saddle. We've climbed 5,000 feet, and in the morning we're going to climb another 3. So they try on helmets up there, and normally we have plenty of helmets, but with 12 clients, that's actually a pretty good sized group. We have a situation where a woman in my group cannot find a helmet that she's comfortable with. So the helmet of choice becomes my helmet because it fits her perfectly. Sounds like Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, but so I decide, fine, she can use my helmet and I'll go without a helmet. Now, guides have climbed the Grand at this point for many, many decades without using helmets. Part of the reason we're comfortable at the time without helmets was because the Exum Ridge, which is the skyline ridge going up from the lower saddle, is not as exposed to rockfall as the route in back called the Owen Spalding route, which is the route that you take if you have weather concerns or if you have clients who just aren't up to the technicality on the Exum Ridge. My group and Peter Lev's group were going to be doing the Exum Ridge. That means the guides are out in front. That means, and we get out before everybody else. So that means exposure to any potential falling rock or water bottles or anything else is significantly reduced. And on the way down, we're last. So that's called the rationale for why no helmets. The third, I'll interject from my 40 years of accidents in North American mountaineering, the third leading cause of injury in climbing is falling objects, either rocks, ice, carabiners, or water bottles, whatever it might be. But in any case, that decision is made. So the next morning, we get up at 4 as usual. We're ready to leave the hut at 4 o'clock in the morning. And we look over into Idaho, and the weather is not looking that great. So the guides collectively, we all decide we'll all go the Owen Spalding route. So we set out and go from the lower saddle to the upper saddle, which is a hike, a long hike through scree and one thing and another, but it's a pretty good trail. And we get to the upper saddle and the beginning of the Owen Spalding route. Now, the Owen Spalding route is well protected for the first 2 pitches. The third pitch, you go up to your belay station, and if anybody's above you, you do have a bit of exposure from falling objects. Peter Lev and his 3 clients were out in front of me, and another guide and his clients were out in front of me. So I set up my belay, and before I know it, a potato-sized rock comes careening down from probably 40 or 50 feet above. And it's not a direct shot, it's a ricochet shot and hits me right on top of the head. I'm wearing a wool balaclava, so I have some protection. So the next thing I do is wrap the belay rope around my thigh because I have a client down there. She hasn't started climbing yet. And I do a primary survey on myself. So I got fingers that work and toes that work, and I was not unconscious. I reach up underneath my wool hat and pull my hand out, and there is quite a bit of blood there. So I reach into my first aid kit, that is to say I take my handkerchief, put it up underneath the wool hat, and pull the wool hat down over it. And I'm feeling fine, that's good. So I shout on belay to my client, who happens to be married to the Undersecretary of Agriculture, and is a pretty sharp person. These weren't hoods in the woods, let me tell you. So Juanita Gutierrez climbs up, she gets to me, and she says, "You were hit by a rock, weren't you?" I said, "Yes, I was." She said, "You guides should wear helmets." Well, I was one of the first guides to say, we need to wear helmets. And this was proof that that was the case. And anyway, what happened was that I was able to go on, and I did. We all got to the summit, and we all came back down to the lower saddle. Now, this is a very long day, and keep that picture up for a moment. It's a very long day. Leave at 4 in the morning, get to the summit, hopefully by 9, not much later, because of what Paul was talking about. Lightning comes in here in the afternoons. The weather, that's when the weather comes in. Notice I didn't say bad weather. Those of you who've read accidents understand there's no such thing as bad weather. It's what you get. So we got back down to the lower saddle, and then we go all the way back down to the roadhead. Now, the trip down from the lower saddle looks like this. It's not an easy route, and people are tired, and you have to really pay attention on the descent. Usually you get back down to the parking lot no earlier than 2 or 3 in the afternoon, sometimes 5. So it's a long, long day. In any case, that's the story. But I think there are a lot of lessons that come out of that story. I already gave you one of the first ones, which is that the third. Oh, he's got a picture up of me on the Owen Spalding route. That was in my summer of my 75th year. The guides usually can do the grand in one day, and I did the grand in one day to celebrate my 75th year. But that's the very helmet right there. No, I haven't traded it out for one of the newer ones, but it works. Okay. So anybody who's familiar with a sort of accident prevention matrix that I have out there will understand that there are a number of the elements there under unsafe conditions, unsafe acts, and errors in judgment. And here's the number one thing: trying to please other people, trying to please my client, who very much wanted to do this climb. Very important to her. Number 2, as I told you already, about falling rocks and objects being the third leading cause of injury in climbing and other outdoor pursuits. But let's go to the key things here. Unless at this point, Dan, you might want to take your poll, because I got a couple of points that maybe the people watching can bring up a couple of what if points.
Sure. Well, let's go ahead and launch that poll. Let's see what you would all do if you were in Jed's situation. What would you do? Would you tell them comfort is a luxury and that they need to wear their helmet, or wear the helmet that they've been offered? Would you give them your own helmet like Jed? Would you improvise a helmet with peanut butter and duct tape like some outdoor instructors are known to do? Or would you maybe even take them up without a helmet? Go ahead and let us know. We have one for improvising a helmet with peanut butter and duct tape. A few more for give them your own helmet that fits them very nicely. And a hardliner that tells them comfort is a luxury and they need to wear the helmet they've been given. So it's kind of across the board. The only one that's not selected is taking them up without a helmet, which shows some good common sense in our audience here.
I would definitely not have taken her up without a helmet. And by the way, I started working for Outward Bound a little earlier than Paul. My first helmet was a Colorado Outward Bound in 1966, and it was literally a Bell motorcycle helmet. But we did wear helmets in the 60s. So for me, the bigger questions here, because the odds, I mean, I'd climbed this thing 40 or 50 times, and we just never had any guide get beamed before. Really no clients. We had them hit by things, but never beamed like that. But it brings up the big question, which is what, suppose I'd been incapacitated, then what? So now with one other guide below me and two above me, eventually I suppose things would have gotten sorted out. But meanwhile, time goes by and people would be wondering what's going on. And it would have been a really bad experience for the clients. And it really could have ended up not in necessarily in incapacitation, but unconsciousness, in which case I would have been in a different category. And then, so for me, the next thing is, what kind of orientation should we provide for our clients? You know, Paul, you talked about teaching CPR to your students. Well, we don't teach CPR, but certainly we teach some basic first aid to our clients and point out to them, which I'm not sure we did that back in the 90s, but we definitely did after that, was if something goes wrong with your guide, here's what you're supposed to do. So protocols were verbalized to the clients. They weren't written down at that time, but we all verbalized those protocols to the clients. And that's all well and good until it's not.
Yeah, you know, Jed, I've been on a number of accreditation reviews where that standard, when a program is working towards accreditation and they come across that standard that says you teach appropriate, I'm not sure exactly how it's worded, but appropriate curriculum to prepare your students in case of an emergency. It's something that kind of takes a lot of instructors and programs by surprise. They think, well, our students can't respond to emergencies. They're only students. But it sort of goes back to that idea we were talking about of there are times where it is absolutely appropriate to trust your students. And if you can give them even more tools and how to perform when the need is there, it only makes us safer.
Guiding the Grand, you may have clients that you've had during basic and intermediate school, and you may not. So if these clients are new to you, you have to assume nothing and go through that whole drill. Outward Bound, you got a longer period of time to help the students move from dependence to independence. But no matter what, I think there's a basic level that you have to teach this stuff to clients. And I started even in basic and intermediate school with straight up guiding in the Tetons.
So another thing that we've been touching on a little bit is just, this is a question for both Paul and Jed. Since things have changed in technology and risk management and just in the field over the decades, are there aspects of technology or things that you may have done differently because of what's available now, if that same incident happened today? Would you use a sat phone? Would you, get your helmet airlifted, or call in other resources, Paul, for that kind of emergency, so that you can, not just be three of you, perhaps getting yourselves in trouble as well? Any thoughts on how the evolution of technology would change how you handle these situations or similar ones?
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I think everybody, the three of us all remember when we discussed whether cell phones were a liability. When that technology first entered, people said, well, we can just rely on the cell phone. And would we make a bad decision because coverage was much more spotty? Would we actually, in a need for an evacuation, head up away from an evacuation point to get better cell coverage to call it in, as opposed to working to take that out? Or I think technology is tools, but if you substitute the technology for proper training and experience, I think that's where things turn left on you.
That sums it up. On the Grand climbs, cell phone coverage is spotty. Usually there are rangers at the lower saddle, and of course helicopters are more available now. They weren't 20 years ago. You could get a helicopter in, but it was a pretty major effort. So even today, relying on cell phone or radio back to headquarters, there's going to be time between when an incident happens and when a rescue can take place. So it is no substitute for experience. Technology is no substitute for a good experience.
Well said. We have a comment just saying this is a good example of the way we have always done it is not always the way it should be done. We need to prepare our students to learn from our experiences. Well,
let me tell you that guides fought this helmet rule for many, many years. And finally, under new ownership, I had stopped guiding when I was sort of mid-late 60s. And they made me the director of safety and risk management. And thank goodness the new owner said, this is not up for discussion. Anybody who doesn't want to follow this policy, there are a few other places I could recommend for you to work, because there's lots of jobs out there now. And, we don't lack for experienced people there. So that's the protocol. You wear a helmet, basic and intermediate school, day climbs, the Grand. It's just what you do.
Sure. And I don't think anybody would scoff at that these days, but it's funny how it's completely reversed. If somebody were to come out and say, no, this is why we shouldn't wear helmets, everybody would think they're crazy.
Well, we had a few guides who said that. People like Jim Bridwell. I never wore a helmet in my life. Why might I start wearing one now?
Yeah, to me, it just seems like, while it's a low consequence that something's going to fall, or a low probability that something's going to fall on your head, the consequences of that happening are sufficiently high that it's just not that hard to wear a helmet.
Especially if it's not a Bell motorcycle helmet.
or a harness made of old van seatbelts, right? Jed, we have a few extra minutes. I know you had another story in your back pocket, so if you want to tell us a little bit about that bear that you know so well, I think we can close out with that story.
Well, it's good because it ties into Paul's bear story, only not in quite a different way. This is at North Carolina Outward Bound School in the late 60s. I'll make it kind of brief. The director of Upward Bound in Middletown, Connecticut, was looking for a meaningful experience for his students. Back in those days, people often mistook Upward Bound for Outward Bound. Upward Bound is for kids who have academic potential, and they go to a summer program, try to get them motivated, try to get them academically up to speed. So 68 people from Wesleyan University and Middletown, Connecticut, including 40 or 50 students and staff, show up at the North Carolina Outward Bound School campus for the famous NC-12. And they get off the bus, and you can see it's, the same kind of thing Paul's talking about. Here you got a bunch of ninth grade kids who are way out of their element. So I'll quote one of the kids who said, it's not that we're afraid we can't do this course. It's not that we're worried about the challenge. He says, this whole place is whitey. And that's because, 75, 80% of the kids were of color, one culture or another. So getting them involved was really the first major challenge. My wife Perry was working with me. We were among the very few who had ever worked with inner city kids before. So, and not only that, we didn't have, this is the way we do it in Outward Bound in our head. It was, what are we going to do to make this successful for these kids? So small victories were important. Perry came back excited after the first or second day because a young woman had figured out how to tie a half hitch twice, and then even a third time to make a tightening knot so she could rig her tent. Of course, we never forgot poles and things like that. I mean, we're more smarter than those Minnesota people. But that was a big victory. And the course goes on, and at one point the students took over the what they referred to as the cafeteria, which was the Phillips building, the mess hall. And they said, we ain't moving out of here. We're waiting for lunch. And I said, well, here's a map. And my gang by that time knew how to, a few of them knew how to read a map. And I said, here's where we're going to be for lunch. See this X here? That's where lunch is, and that's where we'll be. So see you there. And because there won't be any lunch in the cafeteria today. So, well, the stomach drives everything, so they found their way to lunch. And by the way, it wasn't 20 miles away. It was a very reasonable distance away. Then comes solo, which is going to be like Paul's solo. It's going to be put them out the first day, and they're out for 2 nights, and then come in the third day. And it was it was fasting. For these kids, that was quite a challenge, but mostly they wanted to do it. If a kid really didn't want to do it, we'd figure something out. So we say, okay, it's really important that you don't have food in under your tarp or anywhere around because there are bears here. And guess what? We had whistles. So, but this one boy, the first night, didn't use a whistle. He just came barreling back into camp where Perry and I were. It wasn't dark yet. He said, Jed, there's a bear in my tent. I said, well, that can't possibly be, Ralph, because you didn't bring any food, right? So we go back to his tent, and he's got a little thing of Weiler's lemonade there. And I said, that's what the bear is after. And the bear was sorting through. And I said, okay, well, we'll take care of this. So I start clapping my hands, and I say, now, come on, Bruno, you know you're not supposed to be hanging around camps like this. Now, come on, move along, Bruno. And the bear shuffles off. And this kid looks at me and he says, you know that bear. So anyway, he stayed on solo, but he was convinced that we were so dialed into the environment that we actually knew the bears.
That's a great way to make people feel just a little bit safer. And I appreciate the sentiment there that, you tailor your level of stress to the group that you're working with. I know I've come across my fair share of outdoor instructors who are very adamant about immediately upon getting out of that bus or getting off that plane, let us immerse them in a crazy, stressful experience. They often call this the dunk them and dry them approach. So let's just grab them out of the bus, dunk them in some stressful experience, and then we'll slowly sort of dry them out and bring them back to center, versus the idea of graduated stress, that let's start with a level of stress that is there, that is palpable, but let's tailor that to who our group is, and then let's raise the stress level over time as they become more and more able to handle it. And
well, 22 kids left that course pretty early on, and that was because even some of the lower level stuff was too stressful for them. So start where they're at. So in that sentence with a preposition, start where they're at. That's what I say.
I think that's a great philosophy. So we're coming up on 4 o'clock. I don't see any other questions coming in from the audience, but we've covered a lot today. We've talked about sort of the evolution of technology. We've talked about instructor judgment versus policies. We've talked about the value of wearing a helmet and thinking of yourself first, because if you're not doing well, there's a good chance your students might not be doing so well in the long term. Before we wrap things up, do either of you have any sort of closing comments or anything else you want to say before I remind everybody about what's coming up next week and we wrap this up?
I've got one interjection here. If you read a little bit about the history of whitewater paddling here in Western North Carolina, the helmet issue is very similar to the use of PFDs, or life jackets, as some people know them. Helmets were employed years before personal flotation devices among paddlers in the area. And it was actually some of the grand knowledgeable people like Frank Bell that argued that life jackets or PFDs made you less safe. So I think we see parallels in the industry. And I think it's important, and last week we ended kind of with the plug for accreditation, and here's mine. Because I've had spirited discussions about helmets with Jed during accreditation reviews. And I think it's important is that we talk about this, and that we look back to that experience. And for a program doing a self-assessment studies, you really look at the whys and the other part, and you bring in all the perspectives. And ultimately it's that, that one tenet of Outward Bound, that we all need each other, that we hear each other out, and then we see how the industry and how the things progress. So
we're a crew, not passengers, right? Well said, Paul. Jed, any final thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good conclusion, I think. So I want to thank both of you again.
It was my
all the people who are listening.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks everybody for coming. In case you're not aware, next week know that our time is going to be different. We're starting at 11 a.m. Eastern time on June 27th for our final part of this Lessons from the Field series. That's going to be Sky Gray from the Valley of the Moon Children's Center and Pam McPhee from the University of New Hampshire with more excellent stories that will provoke us to think about what we do and why we do it in the field of outdoor education. So we look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks again, Paul and Jed, and to everybody for coming today. Have a great day.